Fast food horror stories. The new manager. Hi guys, my name is Alex, and believe it or not, I was one of the famous Burger King employees who worked in one of the most infamous Burger King branches. The branch that, although no one ever knew it, mistreated its employees the most. It all started when our old manager, who we'll call Jerry, was fired. We had a great time with Jerry. We were so relaxed, and he was so undemanding, we could hardly consider it a job. Yes, customers sometimes complained that we were late with the orders, but most of them left happy because they knew we made the food with a lot of love and effort. The bosses were not happy about this, because they fired Jerry. At first, we all wondered if one of us would be the next manager. But since they felt that because of Jerry we were all pretty lazy, they decided to look for someone from the outside. That's when Jane showed up, and that was the beginning of the end of our relaxing days, and the beginning of a nightmare that seemed like it would never end. You see, Jane was obsessed with time. The man was always seen with at least 3 watches, always looking at the time. Burger King executives loved this quality about him because whatever franchise he touched, that franchise radically improved his numbers. They were so obsessed with his accomplishments, no one stopped to think about how he did them. In the beginning, Gene was constantly rushing us. He didn't want us to rest for a second. The moment a customer arrived, we all had to soldier on and not let him wait 5 minutes. He couldn't stand us preparing the food on the spot. All the food had to be previously prepared and assembled according to the client to deliver it much faster. It was hell. Every time one of us would relax, Jane would appear from behind and yell wildly at him to get to work. It was as if he was everywhere. In the first few weeks, he pushed us to the very limit. Most of us thought for sure he was going to calm down, that he was probably trying to make a good impression, and that he didn't want to give up in these first few days, that he was still new. But needless to say, we were wrong. As time went by, Jane became more and more demanding. He got to the point of standing next to us and timing how long we could make a hamburger. Many of us complained about him at the end of working hours, but no one ever dared to confront him. Not because he was our boss, but because he was terrifying. The man had a dark presence, and he looked at us with such hatred, with such disdain, that we felt that if we said anything to him, he would probably rip our heads off. As time went on, Jin's rules became more and more illogical. Once a week, he would force us to flip burgers next to him. If we took more than 20 seconds, we were financially penalized and part of our salary was taken away. Naturally, some of us started to quit, and this is where the really scary part began. Every time someone quit, Gene would get frantic. That day, you couldn't even look at him, or he would scream at you with all his fury. The next day, Gene wouldn't go to work, and the day after, he would come in a very strange mood. As if something had happened the day he was absent. We tried to communicate with the guys who quit, but we could not. It was as if the people and their families disappeared off the face of the earth. We couldn't confirm it, and we had no proof, but we knew Gene had something to do with it. Meanwhile, back at the restaurant, everything started to get worse. The time to make a hamburger was getting shorter and shorter. The only day we saw Gene happy was when a coworker managed to do it in 8 seconds, but that only made him even angrier at those of us who didn't make it. In the beginning, people were very happy because the food was coming fast. But then the complaints started. We were making the food so fast that we forgot to put in ingredients or did it wrong. Every time this happened, Gene would wait until after working hours to yell at us and hit us. We were all too afraid to say anything to her or to quit. We were sure that something terrible would happen to us if we fought back. And not doing so, not standing up for ourselves, would make it all end in the worst of ways. I remember on the worst day of all, Gene met our outside work. He told us that this would be his last diamond, so he wanted to make sure the staff was prepared. We all smiled and thought that if we would never see him again after this, we would put up with anything. None of us imagined what Gene had prepared for us. Out of nowhere, The maniac pulled out a revolver and pointed it at all of us, who fell back in fear, raising our hands in the air. With a maniac face, he said that he can't allow inefficient personnel to remain on his last day. So that was the way it's going to be. He said his shift was going to end at 9 p.m. and we had 15 minutes to make burgers nonstop. Whoever takes longer than 12 seconds was going to get punished. He pointed the gun at us and made us pass one by one to make hamburgers. At the start, we all managed to do it in less than 12 seconds, but before it was my turn, one guy took a second too long. Immediately after that, he hit him in the head with the gun. My partner tried to stand up to escape, but dizzy, he fell to the ground, where Jean gave him a kick in the ribs. After that, we all kept making burgers. The condiments were full of blood, but that didn't matter. That couldn't matter, because if we made them wrong, we would end up being a corpse. Little by little, my coworkers began to fail every time one failed. Jean would brutally beat him and leave him almost unconscious. It was getting harder and harder to make hamburgers. The smell of blood was too much. Some of them started to vomit, but they couldn't even afford that, as Jean threatened to kill them if they took too long. When it was my turn again, I tried to go to make the hamburger, but something was happening to me. My legs, they weren't working. I wanted to move, and I wanted to make the burger, but I just couldn't walk. Furious, Jean came up to me and grabbed me by the hair, putting my head on the counter full of blood and rubbing it as if it were a rag. Furious, he asked me if this was the reason I couldn't work efficiently, and warned me that if I didn't get used to it, my blood would end there too. Gathering all my energy, my body started working again, and I could answer him the word yes. I started to make the hamburger as fast as possible, but it was very difficult. My hands were shaking. I felt like I was doing everything wrong, as if I was putting all the ingredients in automatic mode. I couldn't concentrate on my work. I just cried and begged to see my family one more time. Meanwhile, I felt the cold tube of Jean's gun on my head, squeezing me with disdain, as if I couldn't stand the urge to blow my head off in front of everyone. As soon as I finished the hamburger, Jean stopped the stopwatch, and with a huge smile, showed it to me. The stopwatch read 12 seconds. I had made it. Well, guys, it's 9 p.m. It was a pleasure working with you. I know I'm leaving the place to capable people. You can go now. Those of us who had remained healthy picked up the wounded and simply left. Jean just stood in his position, waiting for us to leave with a big smile on his face. Once we were all out of the room, we heard a gunshot and a dead body fall to the floor. Jean had taken his own life. After something so cruel and sadistic, you can imagine that this was news all over the world, right? Well, it wasn't. Burger King put up a huge amount of money so that this story would never become known. The victims were bribed and threatened. No one made a fuss. Burger King was too powerful, and everyone knew they were going to lose. My other coworkers and I quit immediately after that, and we even didn't give them time to look for replacements. Sometimes I walk by the restaurant and see that it's open again, with kids like us having fun. When I sit down to eat, I never again get nervous about how long the food will take. I appreciate that they take their time, because every time the food comes quickly, I remember that day, and how close I was from end up like Jen. Ghost in Mac. I was alone in McDonald's one night. As usual, closing up shop after a long shift. It was a cold, rainy night, and the atmosphere in the restaurant was eerie. My coworkers had already finished their work and left, leaving me alone to take care of the final cleaning and closing tasks. The place was silent, with only the sounds of the rain pattering against the glass and the hum of the fluorescent lights. As I went about my chores, I began to feel a strange sensation, as if someone was watching me. As I was clearing the tables and picking up the trash, I noticed that one of the chairs was slightly pushed out of its usual place. I went over to adjust it, thinking that someone might have moved it before leaving, but I didn't see anyone else in the restaurant. As I finished picking up the trash in the table area, something else strange caught my eye. The cash register was open. I remember closing it after the last customer paid for his order. I cautiously approached it and closed it again, wondering if I had forgotten to do so. The feeling of being watched continued to grow, and now I felt more uncomfortable than ever. As I headed toward the kitchen to finish cleaning the fryer, I heard a noise coming from the bathroom area. I walked over and saw that the men's room door was opening and closing on its own as if someone was inside. I froze for a moment, not knowing how to react. Could there be someone inside? Would there be anyone else in the restaurant besides me? With slow, fearful steps, I approached the bathroom door and carefully pushed it open. To my surprise, it was empty. There was no one there. The feeling that something strange was going on became more intense. I decided to quickly finish the cleaning and close the Mcdonald's. I headed to the kitchen, and as I was tending to the fryer, I felt an intense cold all around me. I looked toward the window and saw a blurry figure next to the soda machine. The figure was fuzzy, as if composed of shadows. I couldn't make out facial features, but I could feel its presence. My heart was pounding as I faced this terrifying sight. I decided to remain calm and not let fear overpower me. Surely there was an explanation for this, wasn't there? At that moment I thought that none of this could be real. That day I was particularly tired. I had slept very little, and maybe I was still very suggestible from the horror movie I had seen the day before. I told myself that what happened with the chairs and the cash register were just coincidences, and that surely the bathroom door was just the wind. All of that had been a suggestion, and surely now it was just my head playing tricks on me. In denial, but absolutely terrified, I finished cleaning the fryer, but the figure was still there, motionless. The atmosphere was filled with negative and hostile energy. I felt the air was tighter than ever, and I began to breathe with more and more difficulty. Confused, I looked back in the direction of the shadow, but something had changed. She was no longer there. At that moment my heart almost stopped when I realized that the reason the shadow was no longer in that position was because it was next to me. It had no face or features. It was as if a shadow had taken on a corporeal state. It said nothing, but its mere presence communicated to me that I was not welcome. I felt trapped and frightened, not knowing what to do. I backed slowly toward the fryer, not taking my eyes off the figure. It was then that the entity began to move, approaching me slowly and intimidatingly. Every step I took filled me with terror. I tried to run away, but in the blink of an eye, I was in front of the fryer. Before I could react, my body began to move only towards the fryer, which was suddenly on, and even though I had pulled it out, it was full of oil. I struggled with all my might to avoid falling into it, but my head was getting closer and closer. By forcing myself, I could stop it temporarily, but still, with each passing second I was closer to it. I could feel the drops of oil jumping towards my face, and the heat of the oil began to irritate my skin. The pain was unbearable, and I knew that if I gave in, my life would be in danger. I used all the strength I had in me, and with one last effort, managed to free myself from the entity. I fell to the ground, my skin reddened and burned by the heat of the fryer. I crawled away from the fryer, feeling an intense pain on my skin. The shadowy entity was still there, watching me. My hands were shaking as I tried to get up, but my body was weakened by the effort and fear. With every ounce of will I had left, I backed slowly toward the emergency door that led to the outside of the restaurant. The figure remained close but did not advance. She was just standing there, as she was near the drink machine, watching me. Once outside, I thought the cold rain and wind would make my face stop hurting, but the opposite was true. My face burned so much, it was as if the oil was still on it, burning me more and more. I walked away from the restaurant and sought refuge in my car, where I felt a little safer. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down as I felt the burning of the burns on my face and hands. At that moment I had the impression that if whatever that shadow was had wanted to kill me, it would have simply done it. I couldn't help but feel tiny, like I had encountered something far beyond my understanding, and the only reason I survived was by a quirk of fate. I decided not to return to the restaurant that night. Instead, I called the manager to explain what had happened and asked him to check the security cameras. At first, he thought it was a joke. Then he thought I was drunk. As I started the car, I looked into the restaurant through the windshield and saw that the entity was still there, standing at the emergency door, staring at me. A few minutes later, the manager told me that the police had already gone to the area and found no one. He himself was in charge of closing the restaurant with the police nearby, and he didn't see anything either. When he heard me panic, he told me that the next day we would see the recordings and that today I would just rest. The next day, we both went to McDonald's and reviewed the security footage. My manager found out that everything I had told him was true. On the recording, we could see how I was struggling against myself to keep my head out of the oil, while a shadow was standing in front of me. There was no logical explanation for its origin or nature, but the manager confessed to me that other employees had warned him that they had seen a strange figure during the night. He naturally never believed the stories and thought it was an inside joke the night shift employees had on him. At that moment, he realized that everything he had been told was true. The figure seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. It simply appeared, until in a moment, out of nowhere, it disappeared again. The entity had completely disappeared. There was no sign of its presence, no footprints or traces. It was as if it had never been there. As I left the McDonald's, the manager told me to get urgent treatment for what happened to my face, because even after hours, it was still burning and the few creams I had used at home had not worked. That was my last day working at McDonald's, and shortly after, I found out that it closed for a few months. Part of me was relieved that something like that wouldn't happen to anyone else. But this didn't last long. A few months later, the restaurant reopened and life went on. A few times I went with my friends to eat, and sometimes I would see the same manager walking the aisles of the place. Every time the manager saw me at the tables, he would just look away. Possibly it was an embarrassment, as both he and I knew that another innocent employee would close the McDonald's on the night shift and was a potential victim of that entity, and he would do nothing to stop it. The Silent Man. Working at Burger King was an average job for a guy like me. Often, the nights were quiet, with only a handful of customers coming in for a quick dinner before closing. But on that particular night, the story I'm about to tell you was anything but ordinary. I was alone on the night shift, as usual, and the clock read 10 p.m. when it all started. The night was cold and dark, and the rain was pounding on the windows of the restaurant, creating a gloomy atmosphere. I had finished cleaning the tables and was about to close when I saw a lone man standing outside in the pouring rain. He wore a black jacket and a hat that hid half of his face, but something about his posture sent a shiver down my spine. Still, I couldn't refuse entry to a customer, so I opened the door for him. The man walked in without saying a word, just staring at me with his cold, dark eyes. He ordered a hamburger and a soda, and I prepared his order. The atmosphere in the restaurant was strange, as if silence and tension had taken over the place. As I delivered his food, I tried to make a friendly conversation, but the man didn't respond. He just kept staring at me. Something in his gaze made me uneasy, but I decided not to pay much attention to it. The man sat in a corner of the restaurant, alone, silent. I continued with my usual tasks, but I couldn't help but feel watched. A few minutes passed, and I noticed that the man didn't touch his food. He just stood there, looking at me. I felt uncomfortable, as if I were in a scene from a horror movie. Finally, I decided to approach him and ask if everything was okay. I approached his table and spoke to him, asking if it's everything okay. The man looked up, but instead of answering, he smiled in a disturbing way. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and his teeth looked sharp as knives. At that moment, I knew something wasn't right, but I couldn't just let it go. The man finally spoke, and his voice was soft and creepy. He said he liked this McDonald's because it's a good place to be alone. I didn't know what to answer, so I just nodded and walked away from his table. I walked back to the counter, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that came over me. The night was slowly progressing, and the man was still sitting in his corner, not touching his food. I decided to call the manager and tell him what was going on, but the call was mysteriously cut off before I could say a word. I felt trapped in a silent nightmare. I decided to take a break and headed for the bathroom. I needed a moment to regain my composure. While I was in the bathroom, I heard footsteps outside. As I came out, I saw the man walking around the restaurant, looking at everything as if he were inspecting every nook and cranny. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't stay hidden in the bathroom forever. When I returned to the counter, the man approached and finally broke his silence again. This time, he said he likes silence, and this place was pretty quiet. His words were unsettling, and his gaze kept boring into me. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply said thank you, trying to remain calm. The clock struck midnight, and the man still wouldn't touch his food. At that moment, I realized I couldn't let this continue. I asked him if he needed anything else, if he was satisfied with his dinner. His answer confused and terrified me at the same time. He told me that he needed to see the kitchen, and he needed to see it right away. My heart began to pound. He was not allowed to show customers the kitchen, and something about the way he was asking made me even more uneasy. I politely explained that I couldn't do that it was against restaurant policy. But the man was unfazed. He simply got up from his chair and started walking towards the kitchen. I reacted as quickly as I could and started to press the panic button behind the counter, but I didn't know if it was working. The button didn't react and didn't make any sound. Who knows? Maybe it didn't work months ago. Maybe it never worked. Terrified, I made a really bad decision. Driven by pure fear combined with my survival instinct, I ran after him, trying to stop him. I begged him not to come in, but he wouldn't listen. When we reached the kitchen, he stopped and started looking around, as if he was looking for something. I felt trapped between my duty to protect the restaurant and the fear that was gripping me. The man walked over to one of the meat cleavers we had in the kitchen and picked it up. At that moment, I knew I had to do something. I grabbed a frying pan and prepared to defend myself, even though it was clear I was at a disadvantage. Do you know what silence is, kid? Silence can be scary, right? The man advanced towards me, his blade held high. I prepared to defend myself with the frying pan, but it was useless. Laughing, he pulled the frying pan out of my hand as if I were a child playing with something dangerous. Like a cornered animal, I fell to the ground crying, accepting my fate, aware that I could do nothing to defend myself against this man. In retrospect, I could have tried to run. I could have thrown myself at him. Anything would have been better than giving up like that. But you know, it really is impossible to act logically in that situation. All I could think of was that a few hours earlier I was at home, getting dressed for a boring workday, thinking about what to eat when I got home. Suddenly, it was all over. I was now condemned to death by a man I did not know. His motives were totally unknown. I was simply going to be the victim of a sick man who was going to kill me for fun. As if knowing what I was thinking and how defeated I felt, the man left the knife on the table and began to rub his hands across my neck, enjoying every second in which I could not defend myself. At that moment, I realized something even more terrible. The knife was just to scare me more, but he never intended to use it. I mean, he didn't need to. He just wanted to torture me, to make my death last as long as possible. I could see in his face, in his sick and twisted eyes, how he was going to enjoy what he was about to do to me. Slowly, the man put his hands on my neck. I could feel the veins in his hands getting more and more pronounced, while very slowly his hands applied pressure to my neck. Little by little, I began to lose my breath. The force in his hands was getting stronger and stronger. What would happen first? Would I die of suffocation? Would my neck break? All I could think about was my family, my girlfriend, my pet. What were they doing right now? Could they have imagined that I was about to die? My vision started to get blurrier. I was fainting. But then suddenly, he let go of me. My head fell to the ground, thinking it was all over. If he wanted to, he could have killed me at that moment. But he didn't. I felt relieved, as if I had been given a new chance to live. As soon as I turned from the ground to see my attacker's face, all I could see was my boot approaching my face at high speed. Before I knew it, a terrible pain shot across my face. The man was stepping on me, violently moving his boots as if he had just stepped on a disgusting cockroach. Crying, and with what little energy I had left, I asked him why. Why was he doing something like that to me? Was it revenge? Had my family done something to him? Had I ever treated him badly? What could I have done to make him torture me in such a way? What could I have done to make him refuse to kill me just to torture me some more? I didn't really expect him to answer me, but when he did, I realized what kind of person I was dealing with. With cold, dry, and unfunny words, he told me that there was no particular reason. He was just bored. This was not a person. This was a monster. Enjoying the confusion and desolation on my face, he began to step on my face over and over again. My nose was broken, and many of my teeth were coming out. Seeing me in this state only made me stomp harder and harder, until out of nowhere, he stopped. Once he stopped, he came up to me and told me that none of this would have happened if I had let him have a quiet meal. He told me that next time I should be quieter at mealtime. And without further ado, he just walked away. Once the police arrived, I was rushed to the hospital. The police and the manager saw what happened on camera, but even so, they could never find this man. That was the last day I went to work. Sometimes I lie in my bed, scared, thinking that at any moment he will come back and kill me. Other times, I just wish he would. Truth be told, something in me snapped that day. No matter how much therapy I do or how much I medicate myself, what this man did to me is as permanent as the marks left on my disfigured face. Thanks for watching. If you like the stories, remember to subscribe and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any other true disturbing stories. See you next video.